Tweed first was created in Scotland as a fabric for people working in a very inhospitable environment that was cold and was very wet. Tweed is most commonly a woolen fabric that has been woven in such a way that creates a very dense, tight weave that turns it into a performance fabric.
Tweed's fantastic cloths for outdoor countryside pursuits and have been for many, many years. Good, heavy tweed cloth, and you're out on the hill and wet. There is a wicking away of water from the body when you're wearing it. It actually is warm when it's wet and actually dries quite easily when you're out on the hills.
Also, if you look very closely at the fibers, you'll notice that there are numerous different colors that are woven together or spun together to create the thread. It can be made in various ways, but most commonly you see all these little different flecks of color, and that is connected to its history.
Early tweeds were very often created to match the countryside and the environment they were going to be worn in. So features of the countryside, autumn particularly, a great, say, hunting season, would reflect the brackens and so forth. But around Scotland, the estate tweeds that reflect, for example, in the cairngorms, the granite stone, and you find tweeds that are greyed off, and you can't imagine them being camouflaged, but in the situation, they are perfect.
I think it possibly started with Queen Victoria's love affair with Scotland and her sort of appreciation of the estate tweeds that the gillies and the people working on the estates wore. Also, I think the Prince of Wales was instrumental in commissioning particular tweeds and popularising tweed throughout London and kind of further afield. I guess it became a very establishment fabric, synonymous with the sporting activities of the elite in the UK, really.
By the mid to late 19th century, though, you have noblemen coming from London and the southern part of England, moving up into Scotland that needed a fabric that was appropriate for that environment. Tartan was off limits to them because they were coming from England, so tweed was adopted by many of those individuals. When those individuals came back to London wearing that fabric that they wore for the weekend or their week away, people started to tune into that, and they saw that there was this new material coming about, a new color, a new cut. And of course it signified that you had the money and the means to live away from London. So that's what created the trend. Throughout the late 19th century and then into the early part of the 20th century, advancements in technology allowed for that fabric to be affordable to the masses. And that's when we start to see many people starting to wear fabric for sporting, for golf, for different types of outdoor activities that were far removed from its origins of hunting and deer stalking.
Post-Second World War, tweed was worn, was seen as something worn by academics, college professors, lecturers, and then, began to become subverted and worn by anti-establishment figures during the 60s and 70s. And I think internationally, tweed is seen as an icon of UK or British, Scottish fabric. People associate it with the UK in the same way as they think about red buses and post boxes and all the bowler hat and things like that. It falls into that category of being something which is very identifiable with the UK.
The Sherlock Holmes exhibition at the Museum of London is the first time this collection of artifacts has ever been shown. Sherlock Holmes was a gentleman, first and foremost. It comes across quite clearly in his stories, and so we wanted to take apart his character, and one main aspect of that was how he dressed. He is illustrated by Paget in many of the original stories, so we have a clear view of how people originally saw Sherlock Holmes. But then within the stories, there is great detail about the clothing that he wore. And although Sherlock Holmes never hunted, he is often portrayed in a double-flapped ear cap, which is often referred to as a deerstalker, which would have been made from tweed. He also is wearing, in many scenes, a cape and a heavy tweed coat. And so we honed in on tweed because it is a very popular fabric today, and we wanted to try and think creatively about how to present his character. And so we had the idea of creating the Museum of London Tweed.
We became involved in the Museum of London Tweed project through our parent, Liberty. I think once they made contact with Liberty in the hope of developing a tweed for the exhibition, and from that to make some clothing, particularly the hats, and obviously the deerstalker hat, or the Sherlock as we call it.
When we first set out to design the Museum of London Tweed, we looked naturally to the original Sherlock Holmes stories to see if we could find any inspiration. The amount of colors that are used in the stories stood out, and so royal blue and a bright gold were two colors that were prominently featured in many of the stories, so we knew that those two colors were key to our design. We then looked at the wild variety of tweeds that exist out there today, and there are two different types. One would be considered more the country tweed that you might go hunting or stalking in, but we wanted to make a London tweed, an urban version of that. So we looked more to colors that would be associated with London.
So a nice base colour, strong but simple base colour, for which we chose the dark grey, which would have been a colour very much within the palette of colours of the end of the 19th century, so the Sherlock Holmes era, but using it in a very simple check pattern, so sort of large squares across the simple grey base. You end up with a very contemporary looking tweed, so beautifully created, simple gold and blue lines across a grey background, and we think we've actually made a very, very wearable, very contemporary looking Sherlock Holmes hat.
Creating a tweed for the Museum of London was almost like creating an estate tweed, making sure you get in all of the different colours and influences that you can into one piece of fabric. We looked at the archive which we'd been sent from Christys Hats with the sort of hats that would be worn in that era. We then went through our archive here to look at the 1890s, 1900s, but also moving forward and taking the history as well as current trend forecasts and putting them together to create a very cosmopolitan tweed. There's quite a juxtaposition between tweed as it used to be perceived as an outdoor cloth, particularly for stalking or hunting in the heather and crawling over rocks, to now it being seen in every department store and every fashion catwalk as a commercial, fashionable item.
Fashion designers over the last few decades have played with tweed in a variety of ways, and I think the reason for that is because they've taken the codes and the meanings that are associated with tweed and start to subvert them for a contemporary audience.
To take something which is so synonymous with the kind of British elite and make it into a pair of bondage trousers, or slash it up and stitch it back together really roughly, was the kind of comment, anti-establishment comment, which I think is a highly important part of tweed's history. It took it away from being a very elite thing, and it became a symbol of rebellion at that point. And that's something which I feel very strongly about. It's something that can be used by all sectors of society, really, to express something, whether it's a political message or whether it's, you know, something about where they're from or what they do. You know, I think that's still relevant today.
The international desire for people to wear tweed is quite obvious in the amount of tweed that is sold around the world. While some people might understand that there is great heritage connected to tweed, others are buying it because it is on trend. What that has created is a great desire for the material, that many people are looking for tweed just to satisfy wearing something that is trendy. But what we're seeing is people coming from all around the world to London and the United Kingdom to buy British-made goods.
I think it remains such an important part of fashion today because there's no definition of tweed. There's nothing to say that it can't be a plain texture or a fancy plaid or lightweight cloth or extremely heavy outdoor cloth. There's just such a broad market for the cloth.